Dr. Lee, you are a neurosurgeon, an Iraq war veteran who's performed over 200 head and spine surgeries in a tent hospital. You're an award-winning author of 4 books. What do you know about the brain that others don't?
That's a good question. Um, well, I think the most important thing I've discovered that's relevant to the conversation we'll have here today, Chase, is that your brain is not you. You know, everybody kind of has this. I happen to have a brain on my desk, being a brain surgeon. Everybody sort of thinks that the brain is who we are, right? And we've been taught that everything about you, what you think, feel, believe, do, comes from brain activity. And a fair reading of modern neuroscience would suggest that mind and brain are not the same thing, that that's not actually scientifically verifiable, that you're just your brain. And that's actually really good news, because if you were just your brain, then you really don't have a lot of hope of changing. But, you know, we've discovered in the last 20 years, the brain has remarkable and ongoing ability to restructure and change itself over time. And it does that largely in response to the things that we think about. So, really, if your life feels stuck in some way, or you feel anxious, or you feel depressed, or you feel anything in response to what you've been through, your tendency is to think that that's because of how your brain works. But now we know that you can actually make your brain work differently when you decide to think about those things in a different way. So it gives us tremendous hope. And I think that's probably the most countercultural thing that I now believe with all my heart as a brain surgeon, and also a person who's been through a lot of hard things, that you really have a lot more choice in the matter than we've been led to believe than we do.
I had a conversation earlier this week, actually, and we were discussing the fact that so many people think that the actions and the things that they accomplish are who they are. And so
Yeah.
if they procrastinate, they associate themselves as a procrastinator. And we were kind of talking about, okay, if that's not who we are, then what is who we are? So you're saying the brain is not who we are either. It's the mind. Those are separate things.
That's right. That's right. And so the idea then would be that you come to believe that you're the result of your brain activity and the experiences and traumas and difficulties that you've been through, and the family you're raised in, and the genes that you inherited, and all that. But it truly turns out that you don't have to continue being any particular way that you are if it's not serving you well. And so our sense of hopelessness or hopefulness in the world really then comes down to our belief about our ability to change our future. And it turns out that your ability to change your future can start as soon as you're ready to start thinking about making different choices and doing things differently than you have in the past.
I've been very fortunate looking at it now. And as I've grown older and talked to more people and I have more friends, I've always been very fortunate to have that mindset. If I have something that I don't like about myself or something that doesn't serve me, I've never thought like, oh, this is just who I am. I've always been like, oh, I can learn and improve and change that. But as I've talked to more
Good.
people, I realize that most people actually don't think that way. I've heard so often it's like, oh, that's just the way I am, or this is just what I have to deal with, or whatever that may be. Why do you think so many people are stuck in that mindset?
Well, I think part of it goes back to really in Western education, particularly in the West, all the way back to Isaac Newton 300 years ago. We've developed this belief that it's called materialism on the worldview side. This belief that we are the product of the stuff from which we're made, right? And that's how science is done. Really, and mainstream science is largely materialistic in its worldview, which means, if you're not familiar with that term, it basically means that from Isaac Newton on, we were taught that you tear something apart, figure out the most small thing from which that thing is made, and then you can kind of reverse engineer and understand how it's going to perform. And that ideology got turned into what we think about people too. Like, if you understand that the brain creates the things you think and feel and all that, then you can predict sort of how a person's going to be. And since 1953 or 54, when Watson and Crick gave us the structure of DNA, that got sort of attached to this idea that's called genetic determinism, that everybody bought into, media and science and teachers and everybody. This idea that the genes you inherit create the bulk of the way that you're going to be. So, are you going to be athletic? Are you going to be lazy? Are you going to be a criminal? Are you going to be, happy, or tend to be more, moribund? All those things come from gene activity. Well, we know now it's not even controversial anymore, but it still hasn't caught up in the press. We know clearly that only about 2% of the things that you really can't change are related to the way genes work. Like everything else is either behavioral decision making or what we call epigenetics, which are this whole science that's still being figured out about the things that control not the genes that you inherited, but the way those genes are expressed or turned on and off. And so I think this cultural idea came up that we really are built a certain way, and that creates this sense that if my dad and my mom were away and they raised me in that way, that's just how I am because that's what my genes make me be, and it's just not true. And the fact that it's not true is the reason we can be much more hopeful than we have been about our mental health and our spiritual health and our capabilities and all those things.
Mm. When it comes to certain less serious things, like let's just say procrastination, it can be
Sure.
annoying for people like spouses or things when the other spouse is more, procrastinates and stuff like that. But let's just say let's take something high stake or low stakes. Do you think that there is a sense of, like, there's no responsibility if you say, oh, this is just the way I am, versus if somebody comes in and says, I have ownership over these things, I can change myself? By the same, coin, if they're choosing to do those things, it's because they then haven't taken the necessary steps or done the work to change themselves, versus somebody else who says, oh, I can't. Like, there's no onus, there's no responsibility there. They're just like, oh, this is the way I am.
That is exactly right. And it's interesting because a lot of people get really comfortable with that as a almost an excuse or an identity. People, especially these day and age, we use that word identity a lot, which means that we have accepted certain things about our behavior and our proclivities and our tendencies and our reactions and the things that trigger us and all of that. We've accepted that that's an unchangeable part of who we are. And therefore, as you said earlier, like I am anxious or I am a procrastinator. And that becomes part of who we are. And then we even do things, we do weird things now in this day and age, like in our Instagram bios, we put, our personality type or our Enneagram score, our diagnosis or whatever. And that's basically telling other people, it's a signal to other people, this is how you need to treat me. This is what you need to expect from me. And that gives us an ability to say that if you're not getting what you want out of me, it's because you're not treating me in the appropriate way. You're not saying the right things to me, or you're threatening me in some way. And then that begins to get into our thought processes where, a young man like you, if you're raising a family, for example, or you're starting to have your children, like you've got to think about when you're raising your kids, like, do I want to raise a person who is going to be resilient and agile and able to self-examine and call themselves out on things that need to be changed in order for them to have a more flourishing, abundant life? Or do I want to raise a child that believes that the world is a threat to them in some way unless they are treated in particular ways? And this really can become a significant challenge to young people as they're growing up. And we're seeing that in the data. Everybody thought that this sort of protective mode of parenting that was the last 20 or 30 years really in vogue. Everybody thought that was going to produce these kids that were growing up without a lot of harm and trauma so they'd be more safe as adults. And what we're seeing is it's creating a huge failure to launch problem. Like kids aren't getting their driver's licenses when they normally did. They're not going on dates. They're not getting married as early. They're not able to go on job interviews. There are people who are taking their parents on job interviews with them because they don't feel comfortable or safe. And we're seeing now that the social science data is showing very clearly that if you don't let your kids experience some hardship when they're young, then they grow up believing that hardship will harm them, will maybe kill them or make them very unsafe. And that's what's leading to this idea that I need to craft a world for my kid that's really safe. If they're in a class with kids they don't like, we need to move them to a different class. If they get put on a sports team with a kid that they're not friends with, they need to get put on a different team, or those kinds of things. And it sounds smart, it sounds good, but it's producing kids that aren't very resilient. And that backs up to now what we're learning about brain science, and what produces resilience in humans is not actually avoiding hardship, but it's actually going through hardship at times in your life when you can survive it. So we know there's a part of your brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, for example, that's related to the ability to shift from one emotional state to another, and particularly with procrastination, for example, this pushback that you get from your brain that says, I kind of need to do this thing, but I don't feel like it, so I'm just not going to do it. That sort of thing. The anterior cingulate gyrus in those people is somewhat overactive, and you have to have to teach your cingulate that you're going to do certain things even if you don't feel like it. And when you do, this thing called neuroplasticity kicks in, which is a brain's ability to wire itself in response to what you're thinking about. And what we learn now is that if you make yourself do something that seems hard to you, especially if it seems unpleasant, that your cingulate gyrus says, you know what, I guess I'm supposed to do hard things when I don't feel like it. And then it lays down more neurons and makes itself more robust. And it becomes easier the next time you need to do something else that's hard. And those people then begin to get some momentum, and they begin to develop the type of character that makes them believe that they're capable of doing hard things. And that same brain region is what's involved in suffering and hardship and the resilience piece of recovering from that. And it turns out that in order for you to be able to survive, emotionally survive major hardship, you need to have gone through previous hardships. And
Mhm.
so then if you look at what happens in childhood, most of the hard things that we go through are really manageable and survivable, like, being on a team with a kid you don't like or sitting behind somebody that's not very nice to you. And if you teach your kids that, hey, you can do something hard and it's not going to kill you, and it'll actually make you able to do the next hard thing because life is hard.
Mhm.
Then when they get 16, they're not afraid to take their driver's test, or when they turn 21, they're not afraid to go on a job interview. And so what we've learned on the brain science actually is you need to go through some hard things to be able to go through hard things. And so I think that teaches us that we need to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
Mhm. I believe it was a study that they did, and I think it was on the survivors from the Titanic. Um, they would you would initially think that the younger, more healthy, and more robust would be more likely to endure and survive. But I think what they found was that the older demographic actually was more able to survive these hardships because they had gone through more hard things and they realized that there
Wow.
was an end, versus the younger age group hadn't gone through nearly as many hard things. So they thought that it would just be perpetual. They would always be suffering. And so they just gave up.
Wow.
And I think that just corroborates your point right there. We have to go through hard things to be able to go through hard things.
That's right.
I made
That's
a
interesting.
I made a post on Instagram like 2 days ago. I recently got a cold plunge, and I'm talking to a neurosurgeon here. So, but I was talking about the mid-cingulate cortex as um, the house for tenacity and grit, and kind of
Yeah.
where that is developed. And what I was talking about is research shows that it was higher and more developed in athletes versus non-athletes because they go through these hardships and these challenges and they push themselves and they work through this. And what I was talking about is it's not that people with a larger mid-cingulate cortex become athletes, it's athletes develop that through use.
That's
And
right.
it should be extremely freeing for many people. It's like, if you don't have tenacity, if you don't consider yourself, a mentally tough person, that can be developed through doing mentally tough things. And that does not
That's right.
make it so mentally tough things are then easier. It just raises the bar. So for somebody who doesn't walk and who's, a couple 100 pounds overweight, walking a mile might be that thing that develops that mid-cingulate cortex. But then you take a David Goggins and now they need to do something more challenging. So it doesn't make it so you no longer experience suffering and hardship. It just makes it so you have to do more difficult and hard things.
That's right. And it's interesting. We've learned a lot of different brain areas that before there's a science called functional brain imaging that came around in the early part of the 2000s, first with PET scans and then now with something called functional MRI, which is where you can not just take a picture of somebody's brain, but you can actually see what the brain's doing when somebody's thinking or moving or doing something. You see what parts of the brain are active and what chemicals are happening and all that. And there's a bunch of different things, including cingulate related to willpower and grit, and the hippocampus related to emotional resilience and things like that. That the theory was always that certain people are born with more robust brain areas, and therefore they're able to do these certain things. And now with functional imaging, they've discovered lots of different aspects of human behavior that actually, if you start doing certain things, those parts of your brain get bigger and more robust over time. So it's not ever that you were just inherently a certain way. It's that you trained your brain to become better at that thing.
Real quick, I just wanted to interrupt this conversation and say it is not lost on me how lucky I am each and every day to get to have these conversations. And I hope you guys, as the listeners, know how much I appreciate the time that you take out of your day to listen to these conversations. And I hope you get as much value out of listening to them as I did creating them. If I could just ask one quick favor, it helps so much for shows like mine if you like, subscribe, comment, do all those things. That helps the algorithm know and realize that there's value here and pushes it to more listeners. And by doing that, that allows me to get even bigger guests, more well-known guests, and have more conversations for you guys. I appreciate what you do so much. I appreciate the time that you take to listen to these conversations so much. I couldn't be here without you guys. Thank you. Now let's get back to the conversation. Did you always know you wanted to be in medicine, a surgeon? At what point
Uh,
did you get into
yes
that?
and no. So my parents said that I always wanted to be a doctor since I was little, and I don't ever remember wanting to be anything other than a doctor. But I grew up in a really small town in Oklahoma, and I always thought I was going to be a family practice doctor. Go back to my little country town and be the town doctor. And it wasn't until I got to medical school that I realized that they didn't have the temperament at all to be a primary care doctor. And I really liked surgery, and I really specifically liked delicate, intricate things, and I liked all the sort of tools and the technology related to neurosurgery. So I really found my way as a surgeon and then as a neurosurgeon while I was in medical school.
What was it? The intricacy and the fine-tuned parts of neurosurgery, but like that's a difficult road. It takes a long time.
Yeah.
Was that daunting in any way, or was that exciting? What did you?
Yeah, it was daunting, but for me, one of the things that excited me about neurosurgery is that the great questions of many specialties have been answered. So there's some areas of medicine that we largely know, the big questions have been sort of answered. And neurosurgery has only been a formal specialty really since the early part of the 20th century. There's very little that we know about how the brain actually works and how the spinal cord actually works. And so it felt to me as a young medical student that the opportunity to contribute some real knowledge to the profession was there, and it was just that there was hardly anything that was really certain, and that's dramatically even more so now than it was when I went into neurosurgery. I started my training in 95, and so it's continually expanding what we thought we knew, and now we know that we don't know in neurosurgery. So it's been a really wonderful career for me on the intellectual sort of side to continue to learn and grow and
Mhm.
change over time.
At what point did you join military service? Was that after you'd already become a physician, or was that part of becoming a
No,
physician?
I got a scholarship from the Air Force to pay for medical school.
Mm.
So the taxpayers, thank you. The taxpayers sent me to med school. Appreciate it. And so I went to med school knowing I was going to serve 4 years of active duty when I was done with my training. I didn't yet know that I was going to be a neurosurgeon, so that turned out to be a very long. I finished my neurosurgery residency at 32, and then served 4 years of active duty after that. So I was 36 before I ever had a kind of a real job, out of the military.
Hmm. What was it like going to do surgery over in Iraq in a tent hospital versus kind of what you were learning in a real established and pristine environment that is a American
Yeah,
hospital?
it was the, numerous things come to mind. The first one is, I'm in San Antonio at the time in a level 1 trauma center, a major medical center, as you said. And in the United States, like, we have everything. We have multiple copies of every instrument. We have infinite resources. If you need something, there's another hospital 5 miles away. You can go borrow it. There's just never a time when you run out of something, even blood products and things like that. You almost always have everything you need. And then we got deployed to a combat environment, and a number of things immediately became apparent. Like, we had significant resource management things that we had to think about, because you brought everything with you that you were going to use. So we had 4 sets of instruments, and it took 4 hours to sterilize them. And sometimes a bomb would go off and we'd get 25 or 30 injured people at the same time. And so you literally could run out of instruments. You could run out of blood products. There was numerous times when they announced on the radio overhead, "Hey, we need B positive blood. So if you have B positive, go down and donate blood." So people would go down and roll their sleeves up and donate blood to the patients we were operating on in real time. Sometimes it was the enemy, like the bad guy who set off the bomb would be getting blood from American soldiers who were trying to save their lives. It was the craziest thing. And so part of it was this sort of daunting task of learning how to do a job in a resource deprived environment, and then add the danger element, because we got mortared almost every day. So I survived 120 something mortar and rocket attacks, and So we'd be operating, and a rocket would knock out the generator, and the lights would go off in the operating room. So we had to kind of wait a minute or two for the generators to come on and kick the lights back on, and things like that. So you were adding an element of personal danger on top of the dynamics of doing brain surgery in a resource deprived environment in a tent and all those kinds of things. But then also it was a whole different set of injuries and pathologies than we were used to seeing. So we had different bacteria and infectious type things than we had in the United States. So we had to figure that out, like what antibiotics are going to work against this bug that we don't see in the United States. And then also a set of injuries. When a bomb goes off, it's not a clean type of trauma because they pack those bombs with batteries and wires and all kinds of metal fragments and sometimes biological agents like fecal matter and things like that. So it was a set of injuries in your patient that you didn't see in the United States. Multiple penetrating traumas, multiple body parts injured at the same time. It was really common to have 4 or 5 surgeons operating on somebody at the same time. You have an orthopedic guy amputating a limb while I was doing brain surgery, and the general surgeon would be stopping some torn jugular vein in the neck, and the heart surgeon would be fixing an aortic injury at the same time on the same patient. So it was just crazy sort of things like that. And then having to figure out on the fly how to fix injuries that you never see in a civilian hospital.
Mm.
And, we'd have somebody with some devastating piece of their skull just missing and scalp missing. And we'd have to move tissue from the thigh or something and try to figure out how to close this wound. And things that you just don't know how to do. And you don't know that you can do it until you get there. So it was a real test of your training and your mental state. And can you work in a stressful environment and all that stuff. And then we were supposed to be the leaders. The doctors were supposed to be the ones who set the tone. So if we freaked out every time something happened, then everybody else would too.
Mhm.
And so all of that, and then I think some of the psychosocial things like taking care of the bad guys, taking care of the
Mm.
the guy who blew this guy up, and then in the triage setting, like in the United States, when we talk about triage, it basically means that you go out to the ER and you look at your list, and this guy's a little bit sicker than that guy, so he can be seen first. In Iraq, it was like there are 4 people who are all dying, and which one may you be able to save if you go a little faster with that one, and the other 3 might die while you're doing that. And so it was like literally like I've got an 18-year-old American here who's got a really serious injury. I've got a 26-year-old terrorist who set this bomb off. He's dying faster than the American. I got to take care of him first. Like we had to make decisions like that. Like sometimes I might make a decision that could result in somebody dying, and that responsibility is on me. And so that was something we just never have to do in the United States. And so it was very interesting and challenging.
How many surgeons were over there at a time? How many did you have to work with?
We had one other neurosurgeon, and then we had, I think, 5 or 6 general surgeons, a couple of vascular thoracic surgeons, ear, nose, and throat, because there was a lot of penetrating mid-face and neck injuries. We had a plastic surgeon, a pediatric surgeon, 4 or 5 orthopedic surgeons, and then an ophthalmologist and a urologist. Surprising how often those 2 guys had to operate because when those bombs go off, fragments go every direction. They hit the body armor, so there's not as much chest trauma, but there'll be a lot of sort of genital and eye trauma. And so the ophthalmologists and the urology guys were busy a lot.
Were you in use being worked every single day?
Every day. Yeah. So I was there for a little over 4 months. I did 200 operations, and that was just neurosurgery operations. So we were commonly, if it was a bomb that went off and hurt a bunch of people, and there wasn't anything that I needed to do neurosurgery wise, I would scrub in and help the orthopedists or the general surgeons, or hold a limb up for them to
Mhm.
amputate. You're always working like constantly. And that's why the Air Force actually deployed us for only 4 months at a time, because the Army hospital in Baghdad was a much more sort of traditional hospital. And it was a little bit outside of the combat zone at the time we were there. And the Army surgeons deployed for a year, but they had multiples of them, and they didn't work as many hours in a row, so they could last longer. Basically, we just would we you couldn't work somebody 24/7 for a year, and they couldn't survive it. So the Air Force shortened up those deployments and made us deploy several times in sequence. So if I actually got deployed within the last 6 months that I was supposed to be in the Air Force, and so if I had not been getting out shortly after I got home, I would have gone back to Iraq 6 months after I got home. So it was just a kind of a rotation like that.
Mm. What it's the OC physicians take, the what is it, the Hippocratic Oath? Do no
Yeah,
harm.
version of it. Yeah.
Um, I've never thought about that until what you were saying, having to make the decision between, Americans and the terrorists there. But it's one of the few oaths that transcends, it sounds like, national borders, nations.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's more closer to religion than it is to something political or something like that. The religion of medicine, of doctors. How did that weigh on you? Was that, I mean, I imagine that's a hard choice.
It was. And again, it's one that you're not really trained for because we
Yeah.
don't see that sort of thing in the United States. There's always another doctor, there's always another operating room, there's always somebody else who can take care of another equally injured person, or you could send them to another hospital. And so it was, you didn't want to be wrong. I mean, obviously, there were times when you thought a particular patient might be sicker or dying faster, and the other guy gets worse a lot faster than you thought they would. And there were a couple of times when we brought 2 people to the OR at the same time and basically did 2 procedures simultaneously because it was just a toss up and didn't want either one of them to die. These were young men, mostly men. There were a few women and children as well, but you didn't want to be the one who made the wrong choice and somebody died as a result of it, and then find out you couldn't save the guy you were working on. It was a lot of stress involved in that. It was hard.
When we say neurosurgery or neurosurgeon, is that a general, all-encompassing term? Is there more specific types of neurosurgery and neurosurgeons? Can you specialize in a certain thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of different specialty areas within neurosurgery. It encompasses the profession encompasses brain surgery of all types, spine surgery of all types, so neck and back surgery, ruptured discs and sciatica and those kinds of things, and then peripheral nerve surgery, so things like carpal tunnel releases and ulnar nerve trouble and brachial plexus injuries and any kind of nerve surgery, and then vascular stuff, so carotid artery surgery and brain aneurysms and things that relate to the blood supply of the nervous system. So all of those areas are encompassed in general neurosurgery training. And then you can subspecialize into pediatric neurosurgery and take care of the whole host of diseases and disorders of the pediatric nervous system. You can do vascular and focus on aneurysms and blood clots and things like that. You can focus on tumors, brain tumors, and brain cancers and spinal cord cancers. You can focus on trauma. You can focus on spine. There's a whole host of different types of specialty within neurosurgery.
It's and what did when you were sent over there, are you sent over as like a general surgeon? Like,
Yeah.
hey, I just need to
Yeah.
do whatever I need to do.
Yes. So they sent everybody with different specialty training, but when you got deployed within a specialty, it was you're going to do whatever was related to that specialty.
When you came home, did you then specialize into something more specific?
I've always practiced general neurosurgery. I did a fellowship. I did a year of extra training in epilepsy surgery, so seizure surgery.
Uh,
But once I got into the military, and then after I got out of the military, I've always practiced kind of a broad swath of neurosurgery.
hmm, hmm. W Did you only have that one 4-month stint that you had to get sent over, or
Yeah, because like I said, I got my time in the service ended
yeah.
about 2 months after I got home, and so
Mhm,
I was done with my payback those 4 years,
mhm.
and at the time I needed to get out. My kids were really young, and it was just a good time for me to finish.
Did your time over there, did you feel like it made you a better surgeon when you came back over, or was it, I imagine there's a lot of stuff you had to unlearn as well.
Yeah, I think without question, I was a much more decisive surgeon when I came home. I was much more confident in what I knew that I could do and couldn't do. Because you always have this question. I think no matter what your profession is, I think you always have a question of, am I adequately trained for what I'm going to face? Am I going to be good at what I do? Right. And those kinds of things. And that was a real crucible kind of place where the people who weren't emotionally able to handle the stress, they didn't do well. The people who weren't trained very well and couldn't adapt didn't do very well. And we had to carry them a little bit. And then we didn't have any significant people that were struggling, but you could see the people who were really sort of thriving in that environment and the people who were struggling a little bit. And when you get home and you get back into a normal practice environment, it was one of the hardest things for me was sort of tolerating the things that people complain about in an environment where they have everything. Like I would hear surgeons griping about how sharp this pair of scissors were, or how can I work under all these conditions when I don't have all the nurses and all the things I need? And I was like, really, man, like you know, you could do that with a butter knife if you needed to, because I've seen that, that kind of thing. So it was an adjustment for me to get used to being able to have everything that I might want, and instead of just barely having enough to do the job. So it was quite an adjustment.
Did you come back with some negative side effects as well? Some pretty severe. I would imagine like operating and having to make these choices and seeing this every day for 4 months, lack of sleep, bombs going up. Like that's I can't even imagine. That's hard.
I did, and I didn't treat it right. I came home and got busy. I got out of the Air Force, moved, started a civilian practice. Tried to connect with my kids and all that stuff. And I literally, like, I had brought home a trunk of stuff that held my uniforms and some shrapnel I had taken out of people and things like that in a trunk, and I put them in the garage, and I just didn't talk about it. Like I just went to work, and so I went from that environment in Iraq to being operating in a civilian hospital in Alabama 6 weeks later, where nobody knew, nobody else had been there, nobody else had been through what I'd been through, didn't talk about it. And it was about 4 years before it all sort of came out of me. And I think it's a good lesson about what not to do when you go through something traumatic. Like, don't not talk about it. And so about 4 years later, maybe 5 years, I was given a talk at a Kiwanis Club or Lions Club, one of those civil service organizations. My wife was there with me. It was in a restaurant, and somebody shut. It was a restaurant, so they have one of those walk-in freezers, the big door that shuts, and it makes kind of a vacuum sort of sound when it closes, like a thump. And turns out that sounds and feels a lot like a mortar round getting launched, like sort of kind of sound. And somebody shut that door, and I had a panic attack. Like my brain just went to, we're being mortared. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like that. And then that night I had a series of nightmares for the first time. And a couple of days later, we were driving. I was at a stoplight, and my wife all of a sudden was shaking me. She said, "Hey, Lee, what's going on?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "You just sat through two red lights. Like the helicopter flew by right at eye level, and I guess I sort of checked out. Like I saw a helicopter. I took my mind went back to Iraq, and I just checked out. And then basically within a few weeks, I was having a real full scale kind of PTSD sort of thing that took a long time to work through. And so I think that would have been less severe and more foreshortened had I sort of talked about it and dealt with it when I got home.
What were some of the things that you were able to utilize to deal with that and to help heal from that?
So my wife said, you know what you ought to do is, she said, you communicate really well through writing. You ought to write down some of these stories, and you ought to go out and take me out to the garage, take the kids out there and open that trunk and tell us stories and all that. And I was like, I don't want to do that. That doesn't sound right. And so I kept having trouble, and I had a friend at the hospital who was a psychiatrist, and I said, "Hey, if a person was struggling with this kind of thing, what would you tell them?" And he saw right through it. He knew I was talking about myself. And he said, "Well, I think you should probably journal and write and tell stories, and maybe physically unpack the stuff and show it to people and tell about it." And so Lisa was right the whole time. She still reminds me of that. You would have had less trouble if you had just listened to me, very graciously. But that's what we did. I mean, I went out and unpacked the stuff and told the stories, and that led to the first book that I wrote was the sort of retelling of a lot of the things that I went through. And I found a thumb drive in that trunk that I had brought home that had pictures. That took thousands of digital images while I was over there. And most of the time when we took care of Americans, we didn't know who they were. We didn't have names or any of that. We just stabilized them, got them on a plane, sent them home. We never knew what happened to them. Just saved their life and then got them out of there so they could go back to the States. And there was all those digital images, and of all of them, only one had somebody's name on it. There was a name named Paul Statzer was identified on these images. And my wife said, "Whatever happened to that guy?" And I said, "Well, he was the worst injury I've ever seen. He had this horrible set of neck and head injuries, and I'm sure he probably didn't survive." And she said, "Well, let's just Google him and see." And she typed in his name into Google, and there he was, alive and well. He'd been through a whole bunch of surgeries at Walter Reed in Bethesda, Maryland, and um, and was being interviewed on CBS. And we found he lived in Pittsburgh, where I had trained. And I found an email address for his dad and sent him an email. And we ended up going to Pittsburgh and meeting with them. I got to see him and hugged each other. And he said, "Thanks for saving my life." And I got to sort of see that some of the work we did over there mattered. And that really led to a lot of healing and progress for me, like getting to see that guy and get to know him. And it kind of closed a loop of, did any of the stuff we did over there make a difference? Did anybody survive? Did anybody get home? That kind of thing.
That's that's really beautiful that you got to go see somebody and see the
Yeah.
product of the work you've done over there. What did you maybe learn about trauma after going through that? Because I mean, there's maybe some trauma that you can't go see the product of the work that you've done, or the
Right.
success that you've had going through it. What have you learned about trauma since then in those applications?
Well, I think the biggest thing, and it relates to the work I'm doing now on the most recent book that I've written, like really trauma turns out not to be the thing that you went through. It turns out that it's not the thing that you went through that actually creates the trouble. It's the response and the choices that you make and the way that you think about those things. And that's where the good news comes in, like, right? Because if you adapt, like I did, if you adapt an improper or unhelpful trauma response, ignoring it, not dealing with it, drinking instead of managing it, whatever it might be that you've developed, or, being enraged, or whatever, then if that's not serving you well, then you can learn a different way of relating to that trauma that you've been through, and you can then change the way your brain and your body are going to react to it, and then it can have a different type of effect in your life going forward. Especially if you, like I got to do, if you can attach some sort of purpose or meaning to it, if you can figure out a way to say, "Hey, I'm going to grow through this," or I can see some ways that that experience might benefit me in the future, or some way to sort of redefine how you've been relating to it in your mind, then it gives you a chance to change the arc of what's happening in the future. Because all of us have this idea, again, going back to some of the things we said earlier, we have this idea that we're stuck with the brain that we have, or worse, right? If our brain gets damaged in some way, or we go through something hard, our brain's going to respond to it in a bad way, and we can't fix that, and we're just stuck with it. And if you believe that, then when you go through something really hard and it gives you a brain chemistry issue, or gives you anxiety, or gives you some trouble, then if you don't believe you can change what your brain's doing, then you're really sort of stuck, and that creates hopelessness. Because the definition of hope, according to the psychologist, is the ability to have what they call agency and opportunity to change your situation. So agency means that this belief that there's something that can be done about the situation I'm in. And opportunity means that I can actually do that thing and fix it or change it. And so if you have agency and opportunity, then you can have hope. And so I think the fact that we know now that you can structurally change your brain in response to what you're thinking about gives you hope that if the trauma you went through created some stuff in your life that is not helping you or is actually hurting you, then you can change it. You can't change what happened, but you can change how you responded to what happened. And that can mean that your future can look different than your reality does now.
At what point during your career did you start thinking about the mind and the brain as a separate thing? Because I can imagine while you're over there in Iraq, it's very hard to think about anything else than what's going on.
Yeah, it wasn't then. It was, in fact, I was trained. It's interesting because I have a real dichotomy in my own personal story. Like I'm a Christian. I was raised in a Christian home, and I've always believed in God and heaven and all those things. Um, and if you believe that, and I don't know if your audience is spiritual or Christian or not, but if you believe that, if you believe in God and that there's a heaven and there's an afterlife and all that, then that means that you believe, at least on some level, that part of you lives after your body dies, right? You have this sort of belief in an eternity. But at the same time, I was trained as a neurosurgeon, and traditional neuroscience teaches us that, your brain is what you are, and when your brain dies, you die, and that's it, and that's the story. And so I'd never actually thought about the fact that I held two different competing belief systems at the same time. I just didn't really think about it, right? I went to church and did my thing, and then I went to work and did that thing, and I just never sort of tried to integrate those two parts that didn't seem to work together. But then in 2013, my son Mitchell, who was 19, was stabbed to death. He died. Um, and when you lose a child, pretty much everything you thought you knew goes away because you thought your kid was going to bury you someday, and you thought you get to see your kid get married someday, and have babies and all that stuff that you think we all think our parents are going to die before we do, and either me or my spouse is going to die before the other one, but our kids are going to outlive us. Like all of us sort of, that's how the world's supposed to work if there's justice, right? Um, and when your child dies, that becomes untrue. And then everything else that you thought you knew is now under question, because if that can be untrue, then maybe everything else is too. So you start really getting kind of unmoored. And so it was about a month after Mitch died. We had Lisa, my wife, ran our practice at the time. We practiced in Auburn, Alabama, and our office was on the third floor of a building on the campus of Auburn University. And on the first floor of that building, they were doing this functional MRI research that we talked about earlier, where you can see what somebody's brain's doing. And so, about a month after Mitch died, the accountants let us know that our business was short on cash. And if we wanted to make payroll for our employees, we needed to go back to work and start seeing patients again. And I didn't feel like it. Man, I was like, I didn't want to go back to work. I was just grieving and suffering and angry and doubting God and all that stuff. And so I was forced kind of by being a business owner to go back to work, and we did. And a few days after we went back to work, there was a meeting on our calendar that somebody had forgotten to cancel, and we were invited to go down to the research center and watch some of this brain imaging take place. And so we went down there, and they put a woman in the functional MRI scanner, Chase, and they scanned her brain to see what it was doing at baseline when she was just resting, and we could see what parts of her brain were active and what parts were getting blood flow and all that stuff. And then they said, "Hey, Mrs. Johnson, think about the worst thing you've ever felt in your life. Like, just think about the worst day of your life." And so you saw her kind of wrinkle her brow and think about something. And then you saw her brain begin to react to what she was thinking about. And her fear center, the amygdala, lit up and got really bright on the screen that we were looking at as a little monitor in the control room we could see. And the amygdala is responsible for your fight or flight reflex and all that emotional stuff, that involuntary stuff that happens when you're scared and you need to run away and all that. And so we saw this sequence of her think of something, and then her brain changed in response to that. And then we saw her blood pressure and heart rate and vital signs change in response to what her brain was doing. So we saw this sequence of mind generating brain activity that generated something changing in her body. And I sort of saw that for the first time, like in a sequence. And then they said, "Okay, Mrs. Johnson, stop thinking about that hard thing and now think about the best thing you've ever thought of in your life." And she thought about something different. And then her amygdala kind of turned off on the screen, and her frontal lobes came online, and cingulate gyrus and insular cortex came online. Different parts of her brain activated in response to her thinking something different. And then her blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate came down. So we saw again this sort of sequence of mind to brain to body. And my wife remembered this verse in the Bible. It's in Philippians chapter 4 of the Bible that says, "Don't be anxious for anything, but in everything with prayer and thanksgiving with gratitude, um, tell God about what you're thinking," and like basically change from this thought to that thought, and you won't be as stressed out. Is pretty much what that verse says in my translation. And sort of I connected all that in sort of this instant where I saw mind and brain are not the same thing. When you change what you think about, your brain does something different than it was doing before, and then your body changes in some way. And I just had this insight that sort of when I do surgery on somebody's brain, I am intentionally making a structural change in their brain for the purpose of changing their life in some way. And we watched that woman intentionally change her brain by changing what she thought about, and that changed her life. Her body changed. And so I connected the dots that when you choose to change what you think about, your mind has controlling influence over your brain. And the neuroscience of this is crystal clear now if you look at the data honestly. Like mind has controlling influence over what brain does, and brain does structurally new things in response to new thinking. And all of the neuroscience research is verifying this now, that you can overcome just about any sort of thing that you thought you were grieving. And I don't mean to say that you can terminate grief processes early, nor should you, but you can change how your body and your brain are relating to those things. And I just had in that control room, I had this thought: if I'm going to feel different about losing my son, I'm going to have to think differently about it. Because when you lose somebody like your child, your brain starts giving you all this automatic thought and emotional activity, and you think things like, I'm never going to be happier than I am right now. Like my whole future is going to feel just like it does right now. You hear those kinds of thoughts, and they feel very real. But I realized, like, if I'm going to go on and raise my other kids and be a contributor to my marriage and run my business and get back into my life and make Mitch's death mean something and not just be this horrible loss, I'm going to have to think about it in a different way than I have been for the last month. And if I do that, my brain will change and then my life will change. Like just like I watched her. And so that's the first time I ever really thought about mind and brain not being the same thing, and that they relate to one another, not that brain is generating this sort of thought that you have a mind, like some of the neuroscientists say, but that mind actually controls brain. And so then that gives you, again, gives you power, agency, hope, opportunity to change things. And it just really filled me with this sort of sense that I could literally kind of rewrite the future that I thought was going to be written for me by the event I had been through.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that Mitch and you and your family had to go through that. I am not a
Thank you.
father yet. My wife and I have discussed, when we're hopefully going to start doing that here soon and
Yeah.
become parents. But so I'm literally unable to to imagine the pain that you've gone through. But I know my dad. My dad is very he's very family is the biggest thing to him. So I know that if
Yeah.
he were to go through that, that would be absolutely devastating for him. Do you think that your ability to have that mindset and that receptive ability to be able to understand that the things that you think are going to physically change your brain and your mindset came because you were able to write the book and process your trauma from earlier? Was that an involved step?
I think it gave me a track record of knowing that I could make it through something hard,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, it was a whole class of it was an order of magnitude different in its intensity.
Yeah.
Like even I mean, my faith, for example, like when I went to Iraq, when I went through a divorce in the past before, when I went through all those things, like I never blamed God for it. Like I never thought that maybe the things I believed weren't true. Like I leaned on my beliefs instead of doubting them. But after I lost my son, I did all those normal kind of stereotypical things that you do when you're suffering. Like, why would God allow that? And maybe God's not. Maybe I was wrong about that. A good God couldn't let something like that happen. They really cast my worldview and my belief systems into doubt for a while. And so I think the prior traumas and the resilience that my cingulate gyrus had built from having gone through hard things did help me because I had this awareness that, hey, I'm wired. I've been through things that are harder than most people have gone through. I've survived mortar and rocket attacks, and I've seen babies blown up and all those kinds of things, and made it through that. And so I kind of had an intellectual awareness that I was capable of going through really hard stuff, but at the same time, I was suffering in a way that I never previously suffered. So it was it's one thing if you can, win the little league championship. It's another thing, can you win the World Series? And it felt like that. Like I was,
Mm.
I was playing in the big leagues now with major trauma, and I wasn't sure, but I did have things that I knew would be helpful. And so I started running some of those plays again that I had run and getting over Iraq, and it really helped. And so I think that's all we can ever ask for too, is really, you know, you can't expect to wait to feel better before you start living again, because you won't ever feel better enough to start living. So you have to start living again before you start feeling better. And we know now on the neurochemistry side, like your neurochemistry follows and your feelings and emotions follow decision making and action. Like it's not the other way around. Like if you wait to feel less depressed before you start exercising, you just won't ever start exercising because you're going to get more depressed. So if you have to start exercising first and then you start feeling better and get less depressed. So it's always counterintuitive. But I had the prior events, so I had some confidence that it would work again, and it turned out to work.
What I mean, you went through the hardest thing that a parent can go through, the loss of a child at that time. How were you able to reconcile the thoughts of appreciating or trying to move on, trying to get past this grief? And did it ever conflate with like the idea of like letting your son go at that time? Were those conflicting beliefs at the same time for you?
No, I don't think you ever let your son go. Or I don't think that
Probably the
would
wrong
have been
word. Yeah.
well, I just don't think I could have thought like
Yeah.
that at the time. Like I think more. So Viktor Frankl was this guy, you know who he was, but
Yeah.
in case the listener isn't, he was a psychiatrist, Jewish psychiatrist who was imprisoned in one of the concentration camps in World War II, lost his whole family in the concentration camps. and wrote probably the best book on meaning and suffering ever, Man's Search for Meaning. It's still perennial bestseller for 60 years. Um, but Frankel said, I'm going to botch it, but I don't have the exact quote, but he said something akin to, if you can find purpose in what you're going through, it stops feeling like suffering as much.
Mhm.
Like attaching meaning or purpose to it. And so what I did is that, I had proven to myself that writing and journaling about my experience with the war helped me overcome it. So I started sending these emails to my other kids. We had 4 other kids and one grandchild at the time. And I started sending these daily emails to my kids and my other family members. And I just felt like, okay, I'm supposed to be the leader. Everybody's looking at me to how are we going to survive this? I got to lead here. And I started sending them emails and encouraging them. I'd send them a Bible verse or some thoughts for the day or something to try to encourage everybody. And people started forwarding those around to other people. And pretty soon, it was a month or two maybe, somebody wrote in who had also lost a child and said, "Hey, I got this email that you wrote. Your daughter or your dad sent it to me or something," and it really helped me. Like, just to know that you're 2 months ahead of me and you're moving forward, it really gave me some hope. And so I started thinking, maybe I can use the pain of having lost my son to help other bereaved parents or other people who are going through something really hard. Maybe I can find words. I seem to have a gift of articulating what people are feeling, and not everybody can do that. So I thought maybe I'll just write more, and I wrote another book, and then I started podcasting around that same time. This is a year or so after Mitch died, 6 months maybe. Um, and it turned out that doing that started making me believe. People would write in and say, "Hey, I'm so sorry about what happened with Mitch, but he's living on through your words, and it's helping us navigate what we're going through. And I really appreciate it. And I'm sure he's proud of you." And the first time somebody said something like that to me, it was like, okay, now I have a purpose for this, and I can make Mitch still be alive, sort of in the work that we're doing together now, because his death didn't kill me too, and he wouldn't want one. In fact, a surgeon said that to me, and I didn't know what to make of it for a while, but it's kind of one of my mottos now. There was an orthopedic surgeon that I worked with who was not a friend. We knew each other, but we weren't really, colleagues. And he said, "Hey, your son would not want one death to kill 2 people. Like, you got to keep going somehow." He didn't know how to exactly say it, but he was saying, you can't die from this. Like, you got to keep going. And it turns out he had known a friend of his who had killed himself after he lost a child. And he was literally talking about, you can't die. Like, I was thinking he meant emotionally dying, but he was meaning like, don't kill yourself. And some parents do that. And so I started seeing it that way. Like, Mitch would want me to have a life that still means something, and he would want his life to still mean something. And so that became a kind of a guiding force for me, is like make it matter, right? Like,
Mhm.
let his life matter 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, and not just be over like that. I think that's every parent's real nightmare, is like, are people going to forget? Is my son's whole existence just going to fade out and not matter anymore? Like that kind of thing. And it turns out that being able to help other people with what you're going through gives you some purpose that helps the suffering turn into meaning and not be as unsurvivable.
Mm. Yeah, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is one of my favorite books and something I definitely
Yeah.
recommend everybody read. It's got so much value in the development of his logos therapy, his style of thinking. Um, it's got one of my favorite quotes in there, and I'm probably going to butcher it as well. But it's um, between every stimulus and response, there's a brief pause, and in that pause is our ability to decide and choose our response or whatever. I butcher that, but it's true, and it gives you that. So many people think stimulus response, and there's nothing in between. You just react. But
Yeah.
once you can develop that pause and that insight on that pause, you can really develop your control of that response, and that response decides and changes everything.
That's right.
So how your most recent book, The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery, released a couple months ago.
February.
Yeah,
Yeah.
congratulations. Um,
Thank you.
what is self-brain surgery?
So it's this process that I described earlier in the MRI scanner that day. Like all of us have, because of neuroplasticity now, it's not controversial. We actually have an ability to structurally change how our brains work. And when I say that, like, it's not a metaphor, like it's not some kind of way of thinking about positive thinking and all that. And it's not some therapeutic technique like cognitive behavioral therapy or something like literally your brain has physical connections between neurons that are called axons, and those axons and dendrites of individual neurons connect at a place called a synapse, which is this little tiny gap between neurons. That's where the communication between cells in your brain happens. And neuroplasticity is this process of when you think about one thing or change your perspective on something, the synapses in your brain literally dissolve and reconnect in different ways with other neurons. So, like literally, your brain puts down new structural elements. They're called microtubules. Like cellular construction happens within seconds to minutes of you changing the things that you think about. And so, knowing that you literally have a structural controlling mechanism built into the way that your mind and brain interact with one another, that gives you some agency and opportunity, as we talked about earlier, that you can be hopeful that change is really possible for you. That is exactly the same process that I perform in the operating room with literal brain surgery. When I put a knife in your brain, I'm disconnecting neurons from other neurons, and they're going to have to change and reconnect in different ways. Like I'm structurally changing what your brain is and what your brain does intentionally for the purpose of trying to help you. And that's what you do when you change the way you think about things. And so it's not some sort of catchy phrase or any of that. It's like the mechanism of how humans actually change anything. So like when you decide, hey, it's really not good for me to come home from work every day and drink a bottle of wine and pass out on the couch. That's not working out for me very well. It's not helping me. I feel bad the next day and I'm spending money, I'm gaining weight, and my wife's mad at me or, whatever. Like if you identify something that isn't good for you, and you say, I'm going to change that, and you start doing the work to make new habits, your brain structurally begins to unwire all these connections that it's made that have supported that old habit and begins to lay down new connections and synaptic pathways. And it takes a long time, 21 to 90 days to code in a new habit. But you're literally building a new brain when you do that. Like you're not just engaging willpower and working hard and all that stuff. You're structurally changing the physics and the anatomy of your brain in real time in response to your direction, which means it's never been impossible for you to change. You just have to be willing to engage that process, because if you don't, so neuroplasticity is happening all the time, whether you're driving it intentionally or not. But what it does is it just keeps recreating the same connections and making them more robust, which is why you start to feel like this is just how I am over time. Like you start to think, I always do this thing in a certain way. And it's because you've automated that behavior. A good example of that every day that everybody knows is when let's say you enroll in a new school, your wife starts a new class at a different medical school. She's got to take a different route to work or to class that next day. And she's going to have to think about the entire drive on the way because she's not been there before, right? So she's going to have to think about every stoplight and place to change lanes and school crossing and construction zone and speed limits and all that. She's paying attention and she's really aware and engaged in the process. But after 2 or 3 days of that drive, now all of a sudden she's on the phone, she's listening to podcasts, she's thinking of something in her head. She didn't even think about the drive and she gets there safely anyway. That's because she's automated that process in her brain, and her brain has laid down the pathways to make all those things happen without her having to be mentally involved in it, right? We call it muscle memory. It's not really muscles at all. It's your brain making new synaptic connections. So neuroplasticity is working on her behalf, even though she's unaware that she's driving that process, right? So the problem is adverse things are also created and made habitual by neuroplasticity. So this process is working for you or against you all the time. And so if you don't direct it intentionally, and that's why I tell people, in the world of self-brain surgery, you're the doctor, but you're also the patient. And so if you were going to take your patient to surgery and change something in their brain, you wouldn't sort of close your eyes and stab the knife in there and hope it goes somewhere good and does something good. That'd be malpractice, right? You would intentionally and carefully, with the best skill set that you could bring, take care of that patient in a way that would result in their brain working properly at the end of that operation to help them in some way. And since you're the patient and the doctor in that encounter with self-brain surgery, you're deciding to take responsibility and action instead of letting default processes define how you thought you were. going forward.
Everyone, I need to jump in here real quick and tell you about today's sponsor, iSparrow. iSparrow is made for people who train hard and know that they need to recover just as hard. iSparrow is a premium cold plunge company made for people who want to train harder more often without the drop off. Also, it helps develop mental toughness, resilience, and grit by voluntary exposure to hardship. Head to iSparrow.com and use code Merrill at checkout. That's MERRILL to save some money and start developing mental toughness and training harder more often. Thanks, guys. Let's get back to the episode. What is the timeline for building those neural networks, these highways that improve our default responses? What's the timeline for creating a new one that maybe doesn't exist there, and then maybe changing one, an existing bad one?
So there's a process called synaptic pruning. That's the anatomical thing that your body does in response to changing your thought process. That starts within seconds to minutes of changing your perspective on something. And actually, it starts even before you actually do anything, because the dopamine reward system in your brain starts in response to you thinking about doing something new. You get a little dopamine release, which then creates this sense of reward. If you carry on, that you're going to get more dopamine. So you'll be intrinsically rewarded and believe that the action will produce a good thing for you. So you'll start. That's why if you say, I'm going to go to the gym, you feel a little bit better, even though you haven't gone to the gym yet. And some people, that's enough. So they don't actually go to the gym. They just feel a little bit better. But so if you press through, then this synaptic pruning process takes place. And so two things happen at the same time. You begin to lay down new neural pathways that will eventually, if you reinforce it enough, create the new habit, the new brain pathway habit, and start to degrade the old one at the same time. Okay, so we know the best research says 21 to 90 days to form a new habit, depending on how significant the habit is. So it's easy to make a habit that's not hard. It's hard to make a habit that is hard. So you want to do something like change a long-standing behavior pattern that's going to take longer than, going to the gym a couple times a week is a new habit. So 21 to 90 days is the way to make a pathway robust enough that it'll start to become a default for you. The problem is that synaptic pruning process is never complete. In other words, the grooves in your brain from the old habit don't ever go all the way away. And that's why it's easy sometimes to go back into an older pathway. It's also why you can't just stop doing something and expect it to continue something that you don't do. Like drinking is a good example. Like you can't just quit drinking and not replace the trigger with a different target, or you'll eventually slide back into that behavior because your brain is still looking for that reward that you've given it in the past, that dopamine reward that it's associated with alcohol. You need to give it a different target, like exercise or something else, or that old pathway will reactivate and begin to automate itself again. And the best way I can think about that is that there's a lamp behind you on the shelf back there. So if you think about that lamp back there, if I told you, hey, that lamp is casting a shadow, you should move it, and you just went and unplugged the wire from the wall and moved it and plugged it back in, that'd be easy, right? You take the lamp, unplug it, there's one wire, unplug it and move it somewhere else. But with synaptic plasticity, what happens is every time you do a certain thing, your body basically makes another neuronal pathway to reinforce that and make it more automatic. So it'd be like if you had that lamp for 10 years back there, every time you turned it on, another power cord went into the wall, and it got more and more and more power cords. If I told you to move it, you could still do it, but you'd have to unplug every one of those wires before you could move it, and then you'd have to plug all the new ones back in, right? It would be harder, but you could still do it. It would just take longer. So that's how we have to think about it. Like people give up because they think, oh, it's just impossible for me to change. I've been trying this for a couple of days. It's not working. This is how I am. But it's just that you've reinforced that old pathway so much that it's going to take a lot of work. You're going to have to show up and get after it and keep doing it before the new one becomes more robust. When I used to live in Wyoming, there's a place where the Oregon Trail goes through, and you can still see the wagon tracks in the ground from these wagons that were there hundreds of years ago, or 100 or more years ago, because that path was used so often that it created permanent ruts in the ground, and they're still there. And so if you were driving a wagon across there, the wheels would fall into that rut because they were so robust. They've never gone all the way away. And that's kind of how it is with your brain. Like you can actually do this. but you're going to have to unplug a lot of wires before the old one stops being the default. And so you just have to say, I'm going to use this process of neuroplasticity, self brain surgery. I'm going to use it to help me and not hurt me. And what we've learned is basically if you don't control your nervous system is going to control you, right? So you have a choice. You can drive this process, or you can be a victim of it.
Hmm. What James Clear, most known for his book Atomic Habits and
Atomic
talking
Habits.
about habits a lot. What's the quote he says? He's missing a day is an accident. Missing two is the start of a new habit, and always trying
That's right.
to work and develop it. How do you combat? For somebody who hears, like, I have innate, and something I'm really working on, innate proclivity towards, perfection. If it can't be done to the best of its ability, might as well not do it. And that's something I'm really working on changing, because that's not
Yeah.
sustainable. But when you say something like every choice that we make is building these habits, how do you navigate the ability to sometimes make not the most optimal choice? Like, yes, I could be working on this podcast or working on what's important, but sometimes I just want to sit on the couch and watch a show with my wife. Like, how do you navigate those and decide it's okay to maybe not make the best choice sometimes?
Well, because it's not, again, neuroplasticity doesn't care.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Like your brain doesn't actually have an ability to discern between, are you asking it to do something that's going to help you? Or are you asking it to do something that's going to harm you? Are you thinking about something that's real? Are you imagining something that's not real? Your brain's going to respond to whatever you think about as if it's real. Your brain's just trying to automate things on your mind's behalf to take your mind off, to reduce mental load so you can think about
Hmm.
other things. That's what your brain's constantly doing. And so don't be so fatalistic about it, I think, and say, if I mess up one time, I might as well just give up and be the way I've always been. Like, because again, it's a process. Every
Hmm.
choice is, I'm making this connection more robust, or I'm making that connection less robust. But if I take a day off, is not the end of the world, because the process is still running. And so I can just make sure that I can get back after it and continue. It's going to add a day to how long it's going to take, but it's not the end of the world, right? So don't beat yourself up. Don't, like one of my, in the book, I have this thing called the 10 Commandments of Self Brain Surgery. And one of them is, don't make an operation out of everything. I had a professor that would literally be doing brain surgery, and he would say, Warren, quit making an operation out of it. And it was funny because we're literally doing an operation. But his point was, like, you can do something and make it a lot harder for yourself than it has to be, less efficient and more time consuming, can make it take a lot longer than it should be, and make it more stressful than it should be for yourself. And his point was, make choices that make the thing you're doing easier for you to do and make it harder for you to do the other thing. And so that's why we talk about, in exercise, for example, I teach people, like, put success in your way, like put your workout clothes at your bedside. So when you get up in the morning, your feet land on your running shoes and you remember, hey, I'm supposed to run today. I'm supposed to do this
Hmm.
thing. Like make little choices that increase the likelihood that the thing you intend to get done actually gets done, and
Hmm.
make it somewhat harder. I think James Clear talks about that too. Like make the thing you don't want harder
He
than
calls
the
it
thing you do want.
increasing and reducing friction. So
Yeah,
increase.
friction. That's the word
Yeah.
he uses. Yeah,
Yeah. So, like, if you're trying to break a bad habit, increase the friction. It's hard to eat Oreos if there's no Oreos in your house, stuff like that.
that's right. That's
And
right.
it's,
There was a comedian when I was growing up, brilliant comedian named Flip Wilson, and Flip Wilson had this saying, "The devil made me do it." That was one of his skits he always did. The devil made me do it, and I always teach people, like the devil didn't put those Cheetos in your pantry. Like you made that choice to buy them. Like quit buying them, and it's not as easy to eat them at midnight when you don't want to be eating them. Don't put alcohol in your fridge if you don't want to drink alcohol, right? Like it's not the devil, it's you. Like quit blaming the devil for stuff you chose at the grocery store, right?
who is your newest book for? Who can get something out of it?
It's for everybody that has a brain. And so, really, because I think it's a little bit countercultural in the sense that I'm giving people an opportunity to see their role in their own future in a new way, and it's consistent with operating in the paradigm of what we've learned from 21st century neuroscience. And there's a faith element to it too. Like I think it combines some things that we learned from scripture and science, but in a really science first way that you can benefit from regardless of your worldview or belief system. And so I think it's for anybody who is frustrated with the outcome they're getting from their habits and behaviors in life now, and who has wondered if it's really possible for me to change, for you to change. And it is possible. And so I think if you want to take a shot at having a life that feels different and is producing different results than what you're getting from your life now, this book will help you.
How is it still for people who maybe aren't as religious? I've had people who are very faith centered on this podcast, like Luke Lefevre. He's very strong, very devout Christian. He talks about journaling and things like that. Then I've had David P. Barash on the podcast, who's a professor who's a stout atheist, and he wrote the book The Soul Delusion, talking about how the soul maybe isn't a real thing. Who is it for both sides? Can people who aren't as
Absolutely.
religious?
In fact, I wrote it in a way that I present four different approaches for life and four different ways that you can utilize your nervous system to get different results than you're getting now. And only one of them even addresses spiritual things. So there's three approaches that anybody can use regardless of your belief system. My theory, though, Chase, is that if you're a good scientist, and by scientist, I don't mean you have to work in a lab. I mean, if everybody would approach their life using the scientific method, which is a method of how we test for what's true, right? We evaluate something that we observe. We come up with a hypothesis for how it works. We experiment with that, and then if our experiment doesn't validate our hypothesis, then we're supposed to change our hypothesis, right? That's the scientific method, and eventually we get closer to something that feels true. And I just point out in the book that you're going to go through some things in your life that science can address completely. Like, I want to be a better athlete. I want to be in better shape. I want to learn how to be a better husband, or whatever. I want to learn some principles and habits that will help me in my life. You can do that without faith entirely. You can operate your brain, your nervous system in this way that I'm teaching you, and perform this self-brain surgery with no faith element whatsoever. But there are some things in your life that you might encounter that science is not capable of answering and addressing. And therefore, you may need some other disciplines, theology, philosophy, something outside of science to address those things. And I would contend that something like losing a child is one of those. Like there's some stuff that about losing a child that science can't answer. Like, science can't help me understand how to process that in a more meaningful way, right? So if you learn that operating your brain and your mind in a particular way helps you and you feel better and it works, and then you see that there are things outside of science that predicted that this particular method of operating would produce these changes in your life. And that's where I show you some scripture that 2,000 years ago says, hey, if you do these things in this way, you're going to be less anxious and more productive and more purpose-filled and all that. Then a reasonable scientific approach where a rational person could say, hey, I'm using a scientific method to evaluate this and trying to get closer to truth, and I'm hitting something that science can't answer, but I'm seeing what looks like intention and design perhaps in this system, and this other discipline, theology in that case, points to some things that may give me some ability to grapple with these ideas that science can't get me to, then it might be reasonable to consider that fourth approach. And so that stuff's in there too, if somebody's interested in looking at it from a different perspective, but still from a very rational, science first approach. So I think I'm getting emails from people all over the world say, hey, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God, but I love your approach to this. I like how you're allowing me to think about some things in an accessible way, and you're not pushing me away, and you're letting me think, and I appreciate it. So I think I've written it in such a way that it adds value to people regardless of their worldview or belief system, and then gives them some place to turn if they encounter something in their life that seems to be unanswerable with science, and they just say, I wonder what this would be like if I learned more about this. And so it's not a religious book at all, but it does provide you an opportunity to grapple with some things from a different perspective than you may have otherwise done.
How important, we were talking about actions as developing these neural networks. How important is thought independent of action?
Thought's critical because your brain organizes itself in response to your thoughts before you take any type of action. And interestingly, all of us sort of think that the things that we hear in our head, because it's in our voice and it sounds reasonable, all of us sort of think that the things we think are true, and the things we feel are true. In fact, our culture right now is teaching us, follow your heart, live your truth, believe your feelings, all that stuff that we're teaching our kids. But the research is not on the side of that. The research says that something like 2/3 to 80% of the automatic thoughts and feelings that we have are either strongly biased in a negative way or are inaccurate or frankly untrue. And so that means that tons of the things that pop into your head aren't true. And so if you react to everything, again, Viktor Frankl talked about that space between stimulus and response. If you don't allow that space and you just react to things as if everything you think and feel are true, you're going to spend a lot of your life sort of making up for some things that turned out not to be true. And a great common example to that is all of us have had the experience of we feel our phone goes off in our pocket and we read a text message real quick and we read it in the context of the emotional state that we're currently in, and it triggers us in some way and we fire off a response and then we get a reply that says, what are you talking about? That's not what I said. I didn't mean it that way. Like, why are you being a jerk? And we realize, oh no, I misread that or I misinterpreted it. And the text that I thought I was responding to isn't actually what that person said. And now I'm having to apologize or repair a relationship or whatever because the thought wasn't true. The feeling wasn't true. And that's why in the book, I give you the second commandment of self-brain surgery is feelings aren't facts. They're chemical events in my brain. Like I've got to learn that not everything I feel is actually valid. And if I can put that space in there, like Frankl talked about, and I can get into this space that the psychologists call metacognition, which is our ability to observe our thoughts and feelings before we react to them. This metacognitive space where we can use our minds to evaluate what our brain is telling us, and we can say, you know what, that thought's not actually accurate. So I need to replace that thought with something that is true before I respond to it. You'll just have a better outcome in your life.
Hmm. I remember learning about, I think it was in 2017, 2018. Um, Dr. Matthew Walker started getting a little bit more popular. He wrote his book, Why We Sleep. But I remember him
Yeah.
talking about um, what we think about, like if we run through the process of doing something, and I applied this to playing piano at the time. If we think about the process that we're doing right before we go to bed, it then kind of cements it like we've been doing the actual action.
Yeah.
And I remember learning about that and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go practice piano for a bit and stumble over these chords, and then I'm gonna go to bed and I'm gonna run it through my mind just over and over. And then as I went to sleep, I would wake up the next day and I could flow through that process so much easier as if I've
That's
been
right.
doing practicing it physically. And then ever since then I've applied that to everything that I start to do at skill. Like if I when I'm going to bed, I'm thinking about the thing I want to improve, and I'm thinking about that as I'm going to sleep, and I wake up and I help improve it. It's crazy how much we can utilize thought to improve our physical action and our physical ability.
That's right. There's really good research that they've studied concert pianists, they've studied professional athletes, they've studied fighter pilots, and all of them improve their performance when they visualize the upcoming thing that they're going to do. In fact, there's a famous video on YouTube of the Blue Angels. They're sitting around a table and they're all close their eyes and they're imagining the flight they're about to take, and they're doing all the controls and they're calling out their radio signals and all that. And then when they actually perform, it's something like 20% better and more efficient than when they don't go through that visualization process. And again, that's because your brain doesn't know the difference between something you're imagining, something you're worrying about, or something that's actually happening.
Hmm.
And so you can use that as a tool to improve your own performance. And it's very helpful.
Hmm. I we were mentioning earlier, I've talked to Dr. Alex Korb in the past, and I was
Yeah.
talking to him, and he wrote his book, The Upward Spiral, and talking about thoughts that aren't actually true. I was telling him about the story about how I was feeling very good about all the work I was doing about my podcast. It's moving the right way. It's growing bigger. I'm improving as a host, and I was feeling great throughout the day. And then I went to the gym, and I was driving home from the gym, and literally, like, my exact thoughts were like, oh, why am I wasting my time doing this?
Yeah.
Why I'm not good? Who am I to do all this? And it's crazy how your thoughts can completely take a 180 within an hour, within the same amount of
Yeah.
time, like on a switch, and how we need to be able to navigate those thoughts and understand them as not necessarily true at every given moment.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
a lot easier to say than to do
Yeah,
often.
definitely.
Are there some strategies, some actionable steps that you give in your book to help navigate not always believing our thoughts?
Yeah, I call it the thought biopsy. Really, I mean, you could view it in the same way that Frankel talked about that space. Dan Harris has written about this in his book 10% Happier. Is this idea of separating your actions or reactions from the trigger, the thought, the feeling, the event, the thing that somebody says. Just this idea of putting some investigation or curiosity or even cynicism in between those things about what you're thinking and feeling, because all of us have this idea. In fact, I hate the phrase that people use, that guy triggered me, like I had to respond in this way because of his behavior. Because if you think about triggering, and I wrote about this in the book, like the phrase triggering implies that somebody is pulling a trigger, like, but a gun doesn't go off until the trigger's pulled, and you're holding the gun, like, so it's something outside of you can't actually make you pull the trigger. You have to decide to pull the trigger. And so if you put yourself in that position of authority and ownership of your own decisions, then you can kind of develop a process. And again, once you start thinking about something from a different perspective and start practicing a new habit, your brain will automate this and eventually it'll become your default and you'll get better at this. But if you can think of investigating the thought or feeling before reacting to it, and I call it a biopsy because as a surgeon, like if you came into my office and you said, "Hey, I've been having these headaches, right? I've been having headaches every day." If the first thing I said was, "Let's go to the operating room and I'll cut your head open and look around in there," like you would say, "Wait a minute, like, don't you want to scan or something? Don't you want to get some data, run some labs or something before you go to surgery?" That's pretty crazy, pretty aggressive response to my symptom, right? You'd want some data first. And so I get an MRI and then I see a spot and then I perform a little minimally invasive biopsy of it. And then I put that under the microscope and I look at that and I decide what the issue is before I decide on the treatment plan. So we're going to do major surgery or radiation or chemotherapy or whatever. But now we're operating out of data. Now we're operating out of objectivity instead of feelings or thoughts or fears or whatever. So I've been a good surgeon on your behalf because I'm taking steps after I've identified what the real problem is, right? So if we talk about being our own doctor and patient at the same time, this self-brain surgery concept, then we have to remember that oath that you mentioned earlier, which is, first no harm, the Hippocratic oath. On the first day of medical school, we take that oath. And I call it the first commandment of self-brain surgery, like, don't commit malpractice against yourself. Like, so it is actually harmful to you to behave as if everything you think and feel is true. It hurts you and it hurts your family. It hurts your kids. It hurts your spouse. It hurts your friends. It helps you if you develop this space, this cynicism, curiosity, investigatory habit of looking at what you're thinking and feeling before you react to it.
It's a learned skill. I mean, I've been, we were talking earlier, like, you have the certain type of person who's the hard charging, high achiever, like success oriented person who always thinks the next thing I learn will be the thing that applies and changes and makes things and improves things. But
Yeah.
you often forget that you have to take ownership and apply and take that time. And just because you think the way you think now doesn't mean you have to think that way, and you can start to change these thoughts. But talking about James Clear and increasing and reducing friction, like mental thoughts, it's very hard to increase the friction there because they come
Yeah.
so rapidly and so fast. You just need to develop the skill and the time to examine them and understand that they aren't always true, and that's just a learned
That's right.
practice. For me, one of the biggest things that moved the needle was talking to Luke Lefevre, and we talk. He talks about journaling a lot, and he taught me um, introduced me to just like open conscious journaling. Like, so now I wake up and it's one of the first things that I do is I just do 10 minutes of, he calls it putting the edit or sending the editor on holiday. Like, I don't think about it. I don't judge what I'm writing. I'm just start writing for 10 minutes on, this is stupid. What am I even writing about? I don't have anything to say. And like after like 5
Yeah.
minutes, you can only, it starts to get a little bit deeper. Oh, I feel, anxious, or I was kind of sad, or I was kind of mad about this. And that has been the big lever for me to actually put distance from my thoughts and being able to understand
Yeah.
them and separate them from actually who I am and take the space that I need to respond appropriately.
Brilliant. Yeah, journaling is so important. It's really helpful.
Yeah, yeah, it's been really good. What are as a neurosurgeon and a health professional, are there any things that to talk about the physical, or I guess the not the mind but the brain, anything that you recommend to improve the overall health and longevity and time that we can get?
Absolutely. Yeah, you got to have a healthy brain if you want to have a healthy life, because your brain is the organ through which your mind interacts with other people in the world. And so, for younger people, if you're playing sports involving something that moves faster than you run, wear a helmet. Like skiing, biking, skateboarding. It's not just for kids. You are something like 37 more times likely to die if you hit your head on a skateboard or a bike without a helmet than with one. Wear a seatbelt when you're driving a car. These simple things like that. And then don't ingest substances to excess or at all that are known to harm your brain. So, think about cannabis, think about alcohol, or think about tobacco and nicotine. Those things are directly harmful to your brain and to your brain function and to the structure of your brain. So, despite what you may have heard, like when we talk about alcohol, for example, it's a class one carcinogen directly responsible for, linked to, and responsible for at least 7 human cancers, like directly responsible. So, how much alcohol is safe for your brain? None. I mean, it's a neurotoxin. So we don't allow alcohol on the field in surgery if we're doing brain surgery, because if it gets on the instruments, it kills neurons. Like, so direct contact with alcohol is deadly to neurons, but we put it in our bloodstream and think we're entertaining ourselves. And so I'm not telling you can't have any alcohol, but I'm saying if you say to yourself, like, what do I want to do to maximize my brain health? Like limiting or reducing or eliminating alcohol is one thing you can do that's hugely impactful for your brain health. At risk of Alzheimer's, risk of premature death, risk of brain atrophy, and all kinds of cognitive dysfunction and decline, risk of tumors and cancers and all kinds of vascular diseases in the brain dramatically increased in people that drink even a moderate amount of alcohol. So things like that. Choices about what you eat and maintaining a healthy body mass. Obesity is now directly linked to dementia. And so the idea that the higher your body mass index is, your brain becomes structurally smaller, has been well proven with imaging studies now. So that means that maintaining a reasonable body mass is not only good for your cardiovascular health, but it's directly linked to brain health. So things like that, like if you want to build a brain that's going to support you throughout your life, the time to do that is not when you're older, because the things and choices that you make when you're in your 20s and 30s directly affect the structure of your brain 20 or 30 years later. And so you have to respond to the fact that you're going to age someday by preparing to have a healthier brain now. And so I would say just look out for lifestyle choices and dietary choices that lead directly to worsening or improved brain function. And you're going to have a happier time when you're 50, 60, 70, 80 years old.
Are there things that you would recommend, like supplementation, like a quality omega-3, like a fish oil or things like that?
So interestingly, supplement industry is largely unregulated, and a
Yes.
huge amount of what is promoted, especially on social media, TikTok and Instagram, there's a million chiropractors and brain health experts promoting peptides and things that have not been tested in humans. And we don't know whether they're safe or not. We don't know what they do long term to the brain structure and function and cancer risk and all those things. So I would say the supplement industry is full of information that's not necessarily validated with human trials. So what we do know is that probably everybody should be on a good multivitamin. Probably everybody would benefit from vitamin D, K. Um, there's questions about fish oil now. The data that we used to think was really robust turns out not to be as robust as we thought. But it looks like fish oil at least is helpful in joint health and those kinds of things. So it's probably not harmful, but may not be as helpful as we thought. I used to tell everybody they should be on fish oil. So I think a good multivitamin, probably CoQ10 and vitamin DK, is probably reasonable and supported by good evidence. I think none of the peptides have been adequately studied to say that they're useful or safe for long-term use in humans. And so be careful. This is a good example of this is alcohol. Like alcohol was promoted as being beneficial to your cardiovascular system until very recently. And it turns out that all of the studies that looked at that excluded data that showed other health things that were adverse when they published those papers, and all of the ones that promoted alcohol as a potentially healthy thing were sponsored by alcohol companies. All of them. So that means you got to look at not just what the research says, but who sponsored the study, and make sure that they didn't exclude some things that would have probably invalidated the finding that they're promoting. So be really careful and discerning, and talk to your doctor, when you're trying to make these decisions. But I would say that the other thing is, it doesn't make sense to spend money on supplementation if you're making other choices that are directly harmful to your body. So, like, it doesn't make sense for you to take a multivitamin if your BMI is 55. Like
Mhm.
you need to work on your BMI first, because that's going to have a vastly more impact on your health than whether or not you took a multivitamin,
Mhm.
right? So making choices that are known to produce much better physical health or much worse physical health is far more important than which supplement do I take.
Yeah. I had Sean Wells on, who's a well-known supplement formulator, and he has got a lot of patents for supplement formulation and things like that. And he was talking about the lack of regulation in the supplement industry. He's like, you can buy things particularly off of Amazon, and they may come in a name brand bottle, but they very rarely have what's actually on the list, and
That's right.
they're not bioavailable, and you need to be very, very picky on what you do pick. And it's also interesting that so many people, I mean, I've historically done this, is like you go for the low hanging fruit. What can I take that's that pill or that fix versus, the big three or even four now, but like sleep, exercise, nutrition. And then we're even finding out the importance of things like relationships and connectivity and having those valuable social networks as well.
Absolutely.
I my dad drives me insane. He does not prioritize sleep the way he should. So I'm always on him about sleep. And then I recently got him and myself. I have a sauna here that's right over here that I've been using a lot. It seems like there's some pretty good evidence about
Yeah.
sauna usage for overall all cause mortality as well. So that's been something
Yeah.
I've been using. What
That's
is
right.
what is the maybe the most important thing that we didn't discuss today that we should have
I
about
think
your work?
just circling back to thought life, I have this phrase that thoughts become things. Like everything that's real in your life started with something you were pondering. Like every habit, every addiction, every good relationship, every productivity thing that you're good at, everything that you're bad at, everything you wish you could get rid of. All of it starts with what you're thinking about. And so that means if you really want to have a productive, happy, purposeful life, one that's free of some of the things that hinder a lot of other people, you start fixing that stuff by changing the things that you have in your interior life. So your interior life turns into your exterior life. And so I think, like, it's not a trivial thing how you direct your thought life. And I think what you said, starting your morning with setting some intentionality around what you do with those first minutes or hours of your day, and how you think about the things that you're going to encounter that day, because your brain again begins structurally modeling and making things habitual, that or plays that it's going to run when you encounter certain situations. Chris Voss, the FBI hostage negotiator that wrote a book called Never Split the Difference, he says, when the pressure's on, we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to our preparation. James Clear stole that line from him, modified it a little bit, but it came from Chris Voss. That basically pressure doesn't make us better than what we've prepared for. It makes us worse if we're unprepared. So spend time in your thought life preparing for the things that are going to turn out into your physical life, and you'll have a better outcome.
Is it Hebb's law? Neurons that fire together wire together.
That's right. That's neuroplasticity. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dr. Leah, this was an absolute pleasure. I enjoy
That's
talking
been
with
great.
people, especially about neuroplasticity and neuroscience and a way we can improve, because it's something that I'm very passionate about working on with myself, and it gives me great joy to have the mindset that I can improve and change and rid myself of the things that I maybe wish I didn't have, and improve the things that I do like about myself. I like to end every podcast with two questions. The first being, who do you think I should speak to next and why? And then the second is based off of a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote: if we encounter a man of rare intellect, we should ask him what books he reads. What's a book you'd recommend for me?
Um, I think I would. I'll start on the book question. My friend Jeffrey Schwartz is one of the most famous psychiatrists in the world, and he really figured out how to help people with obsessive compulsive disorder without medication or with a lot less medication. So he's a really strong voice in that space. But he wrote a book called The Mind and the Brain that gives you all the science about the difference between mind and brain and why it matters in your life. And that would be a great book for you to read. And Jeffrey Schwartz might be an interesting guy for you to talk to. Um,
Yeah.
he's a brilliant neuropsychiatrist at UCLA. So I think Mind and the Brain with Jeffrey Schwartz would be a great book for you to think about. Um, yeah. And what was the first question?
Who do you think I should speak to next and why? But
Yeah.
you may have answered
Um,
that.
maybe Schwartz. I was going to say Alex Cord, but you've already talked to Alex. His book, The Upward Spiral, is really important. Um, and then one more, I think, guy that you would get a lot out of is Steve Messler is an Olympic gold medal bobsledder who's in the U.S. Olympic Hall of Fame, and he is just a brilliant voice in performance and resilience. And you'd enjoy talking to Steve. He's on Instagram. You should connect with him. Tell him you know me. He'd be a great guest on your show. Really dynamic, good guy.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'd love to talk to them. I'll definitely reach out. Uh, where can people follow you? Where can they get more of your work and stay informed and up to date with you?
Yeah, my podcast is available everywhere. The Dr. Lee Warren podcast. My website is just drleewarren.com, DRLEEWARREN.com. And my book's available everywhere books are sold and easy to find me.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chase. It's been a pleasure talking to you, man. Thank you.